Now the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Garrity of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Good, bad, crazy martinis for you as usual. Don't forget that Jim is also the author of the forthcoming The Weed Agency, due out June 3rd. You can pre-order your copies now at Amazon and other sites. On to the first martini now, Jim. It was just yesterday we had a passionate and very powerful speech on the House floor. I guess it would have been from Wednesday from Georgia Democratic Congressman David Scott, who was not at all impressed by what's going on at the VA or with the president's response to it at that press conference on Wednesday. That very same day, former Nebraska Senator Bob Kerrey, who of course was a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient due to his service in Vietnam, appeared on Hardball with Chris Matthews. Kerrey went right out there and said two important things. He thinks heads need to roll, and he's not sympathetic at all to the fact that this problem's been around for a while.
And in this case, I think there's an urgency for General Shinseki, who's an honorable man who served his country honorably, but he needs to step aside. And the brand of the VA has been damaged. It didn't just start in Arizona. And remember here in Washington, D.C., when Walter Reed patients were being discharged into sort of almost a warehousing situation.
Your paper was breaking the story.
Dana Priest wrote that story. The problem hasn't been fixed.
Right.
The president campaigned against that.
Okay, here's the problem.
He campaigned against that.
He's making the point that a lot of other folks have made, that the administration can't argue that it didn't see this coming. And as even Eugene Robinson, who's the other panelist there, the liberal columnist from the Washington Post, saying you can't blame this on Bush. You've been in office for 5.5 years now. This is your issue. And you campaigned on it, like Kerry said.
It's a mind-boggling turn of events. I suppose it's nice to see there is something that can overcome partisanship. For his credit, Kerry has always been a guy who, as a veteran, has put these issues near the forefront. He's always been pretty blunt and not afraid to criticize other Democrats. I think some of us may remember his criticism of Bill Clinton a couple years back. In this case, at some point, you know Shinseki's going to have to go. And it's kind of fascinating to see just who's not willing to come to his aid. And the few remaining who are, including the president and somebody else we'll get to in the next martini. But just the idea that there's kind of this striking consensus, and it really is indefensible, and yet you have two of the most important people, one being the president of the United States and the second being, Bernie Sanders, who's the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the Senate, acting like this is perfectly normal. This is a routine scandal. We'll look into this, and it's not a particularly big deal. One, kudos to Kerry, kudos to the other House Democrats who have said this, kudos to every Democrat who's willing to do something that the Obama administration doesn't want to hear right now. On the other hand, it's kind of striking that we have an epic scandal on our hands. Veterans have died. We know that they're investigating 24, 25 different facilities. New whistleblowers keep coming out of the woodwork. The line becomes less facetious and more incredulous each passing day. What would Shinseki have to do for people to not have faith in him? I mean, basically they're saying at this point is that anything can happen and I will not turn my back on Eric Shinseki, that any level of performance, any revelation is acceptable because he's our guy and we're going to stick with him. And that's not the way the system of government is supposed to operate. You're supposed to have accountability. And right now the accountability is, well, we're going to investigate it and we'll get back to you later. And it's just that just doesn't cut the mustard in a scandal with consequences as dire and devastating as this one.
On the very same day that the president finally addressed this on Wednesday, the House of Representatives later that day passed the VA Accountability Act by a very bipartisan vote of 390 to 33. And then Marco Rubio introduced it on the Senate side, but due to the Senate rules, it was a unanimous consent request. And as Jim just mentioned a moment ago, it was the chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, the independent, Bernard Sanders of Vermont, who said that, no, I think you have some good ideas here, but we need to take our time. We need to have some hearings on this. And quite frankly, we haven't read the bill, which in and of itself is a laughable excuse from the Senate Democrats. But as Marco Rubio pointed out, Jim, it's 2 pages. Doesn't take a whole lot of time. And essentially the point of the bill was to give the Veterans Affairs Secretary more power to fire bureaucrats who clearly aren't getting the job done. So this problem lingers on for at least another few weeks.
Yeah, this is why you shouldn't elect a socialist. I know that, Vermont is a very liberal state and all that stuff, but I mean, Bernie Sanders really is running around on this topic like he's not afraid of anybody. He's certainly not afraid of any, outrage at home. So, for our listeners in Vermont, both of you, this is time to let Bernie Sanders know this is not acceptable on 3 different levels. One, He was asked, should Shinseki resign? And that's a pretty, big question. We talked about it in the previous Martini. And Bernie Sanders didn't just say no. He did an interview with the New York Daily News reporter that aired on C-SPAN. He said it was a decisive no. It was emphatic no. I mean, Bernie Sanders seems to think it's kind of ridiculous that anyone would suggest Shinseki should either resign or be fired. And no, Senator Sanders, you're the one who's being ridiculous right now, right? I mean, he doesn't seem to understand why anybody would be all that upset with Shinseki over this. This is a good way. Martini that kind of indicates, why we like Marco Rubio. I mean, he recognizes this. He's pushing this as hard as he can. As he pointed out, it's a 2-page bill, so it's not like this is an enormous thing that requires lots of review. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, you're Bernie Sanders and you have some problem with this bill. Okay, let's do it. Let's fix it. You can't go home to a Memorial Day event and talk about how much you love veterans and then leave this bill sitting there on your desk collecting dust. That's exactly what he says he's going to do. We're going to hold hearings next month. And he doesn't want to take up any legislation until they hold hearings. Because, time's not a matter of the essence, right, Greg? It's not like there's somebody who's currently waiting for care right now. We're going to hold a hearing on that legislation, another legislation in early June. Well, this is something that, this is your job, guys. This is something you're supposed to do. And the other thing is he just made this unbelievably snide comment. I'm very glad that my Republican colleagues are now beginning to focus on veterans issues, and we need to, no, take that and stick it where the sun don't shine, Senator. All right, don't pull the line that, you're the only one who's ever cared about veterans when you're the one saying Shinseki shouldn't go, and you don't understand why all the concern about all this is. Bernie Sanders has gone too far this time, and he needs to hear from his constituents, and he needs to be told that this is not acceptable, and that if you have a problem with that bill, then fine. You're allowed to amend it. You're allowed to change it, but you do it now. You don't sit around for a couple of weeks waiting for it, because more and more, this looks like a strategy by the administration and its allies to get this story out of the headlines. Just wait it out. Put it on the back burner. Wait for other news to displace it from the front pages. It'll blow over eventually. And I don't think this will blow over eventually, but this is an insulting approach to those veterans who are waiting for care right now. And you can't pursue that strategy and then turn around and tell us how much you care about veterans.
Back on the House side, I mentioned that lopsided vote, 390 to 33. One of the 33 was Steny Hoyer of Maryland, who's the number 2 Democrat in the House, right behind Nancy Pelosi. He said he voted against it because he doesn't think political appointees should have the power to go in and fire career bureaucrats. And I think most people who are looking at this scandal are going, no, that's exactly the power that they should have.
Yeah, you kind of say, wait, they don't have them already? That's
right.
The first, kind of baffling thing about it. Secondly, if we need to, and this is not me trying to hijack this awful event to promote the book, then maybe we need to really look at serious civil service reform. And we need to make it a lot easier to fire people. Because it sounds like there was a system-wide, or at least, in many of these hospitals, this wasn't one bad apple. This wasn't one doctor falsifying records. This was supervisors falsifying records and then, pressuring the administrative aides if they didn't want to go along with falsifying the records. If you don't have good data, if the report comes back to Washington, yeah, we've got a really big backlog, it's getting worse, veterans are waiting too long for care, then at least they can do something about it, right? I mean, you need to solve a problem, you need to know that it exists. The approach of we're going to falsify them because we don't want to get in trouble means that the problem never gets solved because everybody walks around in this false sense of security that the system's working the way it's supposed to. So if you're chairing the Veterans Affairs Committee, this is supposed to be your mission in life. This is supposed to be what you're supposed to do. And he's acting like it's just another routine funding bill or something. So it's just utterly this is not a bad martini, Greg. This is an appalling martini.
It certainly is. So as we head into the weekend, a little bit more lighthearted as we head to the crazy martini here. And Jim, I almost feel like Jim Nance should be here because we're down to the final four.
Yes.
Hello, friends. The Republican National Committee has whittled down the list of 2016 convention cities to 4. They kicked Cincinnati and Las Vegas to the curb because, Jim, what could happen with people in Sin City for an entire week in 100-degree heat?
The problem is what happens in Vegas doesn't actually stay in Vegas.
So now we have the final 4. And we've got Dallas, which, of course, was the scene of Reagan's triumphant renomination in 1984 on his way to a landslide. You've got Kansas City, where he lost the nomination to Gerald Ford, but a lot of conservatives look at that fondly. It's in the heartland. You've got Denver. Not sure if the Greek columns are still there, but that was a very successful convention site for the Democrats in 2008, and hopefully it'll be a battleground state. Then you've got Cleveland in the ultimate battleground state, but Cleveland and winning usually don't go that well together. So, Jim, how do you expect this bracket to play out?
I'm sorry, Hugh Hewitt just threw a brick through my window in response to that statement. So the couple things worth noting. One, we should dispel from our minds any idea that having the convention in a city helps you win the state. It has not worked out that way. Republicans didn't win Florida last time after having it in Tampa. They didn't win New York when they had it in New York City in 2004. They didn't win in Minnesota when they had it in St. Paul in 2008. Just the way it is. And so it's not like, oh, let's do it there. That way we'll win the state. But ironically, it is. There are a couple of swing states here. I think you can definitely say, Ohio definitely is one. Denver is one. It's hard to not look at this selfishly and just kind of observe that most of these cities, you're not going to see a lot of the city during the convention. You cover the speeches, and the stages all pretty much look the same when you're, for everybody watching at home and TV. So to me, the real question is the city used to holding big events and big conventions, and is it easy to get around, and can it handle the giant security pressures? And obviously there's, lots of protesters, and there's always a present threat of potential terrorism and all the other kind of stuff that goes with it. It seems like they're all big cities who are used to holding big events. Earlier in the process, they'd had Columbus, and I wasn't quite sure that was, ready for, the descending of at least 5,000 delegates, 15,000 media, and God knows how many other hangers-on and protesters and things like that. If these four, Cleveland, as you said, I'm sure Drew Carey would love it. We could all kind of reenact the opening credits of the Drew Carey show. Denver, it seemed to go pretty well for the Democrats. I think you can insert your marijuana joke here. Just as the debate in Denver didn't go well for President Obama, I hope everyone could adjust to altitude before they give their convention speeches and things like that. I don't want any lightheaded nominees, mangling their words or something like that. Kansas City's kind of an interesting choice. Missouri's not quite a swing state anymore, but I think it kind of stands for heartland values, and there's kind of a nice story to be told there. It's funny, I'm seeing articles referring to Dallas as an underdog, and you want to talk about, fourth largest city in the country, obviously, deep red state, home of Glenn Beck and his broadcasting empire. I think there's a lot of potential for Dallas. So I think if I had to guess, I think that's the one I think you're going to see. You might have lots of J.R. Ewing jokes and stuff like that, but I think that Dallas seems like the city. But I think this doesn't really necessarily fit our crazy Martini, other than the idea that at one point somebody really thought putting lots of Republican delegates in Las Vegas was a really good idea. You can have a good vacation in Vegas. You can do lots of other stuff in Vegas. You don't want to hold a political convention in Vegas. And then secondly, you want one where you're going to have as few problems as possible. Thankfully, I think these remaining cities are likely to give you no problems, unless in Cleveland the river gets set on fire again.
Oh, that hasn't happened since the days of Mayor Kucinich. But
That's right. Get Kucinich on the host committee.
What could possibly go wrong with that? Jim, I will be out next week. Brett Winterble will be in for me Tuesday through Thursday. We certainly want to wish everyone a happy Memorial Day weekend. We thank those who are in uniform, who have worn the uniform, their families, and particularly those who have family members who gave the ultimate sacrifice for this country. So, Jim, I know you and I both will be thinking about that this weekend.
Indeed we will, Greg. I will be back next week. Enjoy your week off. And what are the odds something wacky will happen next week, right, Greg?
Pretty good, actually.
Yeah.
They usually do when I'm gone. Jim Garrity of National Review. Don't forget to pre-order The Weed Agency. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Please tune in Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.